Mark, could you explain what happens in the brain when a concussion occurs? And also, how many concussions would have to occur to experience memory loss?
Sure. Concussions are a hot topic in terms of different
They are,
leagues.
aren't they? Yes.
The NFL has come out with a report. The National Hockey League has come out with a report. I believe the NCAA has got a report about how concussions affect their athletes. And so they have the commonality that with a concussion is the rapid deceleration of the brain.
It is.
It means that the brain, while traveling forward typically, comes to an abrupt stop and smacks into the inside of the skull.
Okay.
Where that happens, there's bruising and damage, inflammation, irritation, and swelling, which of course the initial symptoms might be disorientation, trouble speaking, nausea, vomiting, and of course you could have unconsciousness. Now, when you look at sports injuries happening as a whole, the NFL report really sheds a lot of light saying that these issues aren't just short time. They used to think that a player gets injured, he might sit out a few plays or even a few days and gets back in the game and he's A-okay, and it was just like sort of a bruise that healed itself, no long-term damage.
Right, exactly, just like with the other parts of the body.
Absolutely, and you know that was a practical assumption. Well, it turns out that there's long-standing effects from these types of concussions. And you don't have to be a professional to experience a concussion and have the same risk or danger, but they were able to study their athletes and look at them over a period of time and say that these athletes that had these head collisions, that was their commonality, being professional football players. They also played in college and high school and maybe Pee-wee leagues, who knows.
Yes.
They were starting to get Alzheimer's disease on average at a much younger rate
Really?
and a much higher instance. I believe it was like 13 times more likely.
Wow.
It could have even been higher now that I think of it, but essentially, regardless of that, there's a much greater propensity for getting diseases by looking at the athletes because of their head contacts that they had. So the lessons we learned from the pro athletes is that our own kids that are playing high school sports or even younger, when they get a concussion, that first concussion needs to be respected. The second concussion is a lot more likely to get, and it doesn't necessarily even take a second concussion to have this type of damage, so you need to be careful. This type of damage does accumulate one head injury at a time.
Oh, so it's very cumulative, okay.
And it just seemingly, if you look at the science, it seemingly just accelerates the aging process. So you could look at someone, and there's not hard and fast figures on this, but if you can just imagine someone who's now 50 that has the mind of a 75-year-old. Okay?
That's what happens.
There's an acceleration that happens to all the processes inside the brain that cause this to happen quicker. And you can't predict how quick it's going to happen, how severe or the manifestation is going to be. That's why prevention is key, and of course wearing proper headgear is a part of that. But keep in mind, you're wearing the proper headgear and your brain continues to float inside your skull and goes into that inside of the skull with every collision. The damage still happens even if you have the best equipment. So prevention is the key for that.
And someone who had a head trauma injury, like in a car accident, they would be in for the same thing, right?
Absolutely, and certainly that the type of impact that might have just happened once in their life can trigger events that happen in the future. Spinal trauma and nervous system trauma and the brain trauma can start a cascade of different chemical events that make the brain more sensitive to memory loss over time. So it could have been something that happened when you're 25, that all of a sudden you have a rapid memory loss problem happening at age 55. And I've seen this, I have a good friend that went through this. The only thing that happened in her life, she had no genetic history, no family history of disease, but there was 2 car accidents that she had in her early 20s. She went between the ages of 55, being one of the brightest women I knew, to about age 60, where she had passed on. And in between that had become completely incapacitated.
Okay, so what do we need to do? I mean, if we've had concussions, what do we need to look for?
With the concussion, we need to respect the fact that if someone has had an injury during a game, let them sit out, get them under physician's care, and let the physician assess to see when they can come back into the game. Coaches and parents really need to get on the same page on this.
All right.
Because we don't expect to have a licensed neurologist on the sideline of every athletic event in America.
Right.
We have to respect the fact that if we're concerned that something might have happened, we presume that it did. And the worst thing that happens is that they get to play the next week and they were absolutely healthy the whole time. But we prevent the risk from happening because that second concussion can accelerate the damage even further if the body isn't completely repaired. It's like, well, getting a bruise on a bruise. Boy, the second time you get that, boy, it really hurts. Why? Everything's tender, the damage was already done from the first event, and you could make it twice as bad, if not more than that. So we have to look at that and make sure that people get assessed to see that their cognition has not been adversely affected. And yes, you can spring back from these events in the short term.
Okay.
You just need to really understand the risk long term. And I like my kids playing sports. I'm a fan of sports. I just want to make sure that everyone understands the risks. Pulling that player out, putting in the second string player is fine. You can preserve your athletes for the entire season then, instead of someone going out with a season-ending injury. Now the pros have looked at that and say, well, because there's a lot of money involved,
yes.
they said, well, we're going to protect our investments here. And so we're going to pull a quarterback out so that he can play in the postseason, and we're not going to risk him for these other games. Well, if we address that with other athletes, we'll probably make the most of their health, which is the most important thing. That's why we're exercising, isn't it? It's why we're playing competitive sports, because it's a good and positive influence on our kids. Let's preserve all of their faculties going through this.
Well put. Thank you.